want to engage your minds about the notion of this and the way to go back. Now, I don't want to confuse going back to the land with visiting the land. That's two different tracks of reasoning. So far, I've been able to visit the land, but I've not lived in the land. But I can visit. But now lately, because of the virus, I can't even visit now. And I'm increasingly becoming less interested in this because of my disgust with how that government is there and the way they're managing that society, particularly through this virus circumstance. So I got mixed emotions about even visiting there, but I want to go back. So
Elder.
Yes, sir.
Well, I can tell you the importance of it.
All right.
Because you're saying right now, everybody's fleeing to different places. But see, like you said, there's a lot of blind leading a blind situation. So you got a lot of these so-called leaders that are looking for puffed up off ego and power and just being a hit or something. And having people following them. Now you seen a lot of Israelites going to like Tanzania, different places. But we're hearing about people trying to leave America, but then when they get to these places, there's things going on. So is those places really dwelling places in the Most High, or are you somewhere over there being deceived? Because people going, when you get to these places, okay, like you just brought up the example about Ben Ami. Those people follow that man over there and burned their passports, went over there, and now he's proclaiming he the Messiah. So now people are, not following Yahshua, following the man. So in the midst of them trying to go somewhere and be not defiled by America, you went over there and lost the faith that you at least had when you was over here. So I just see the importance of just fleeing somewhere and not focusing on the land. It's like it spiritually takes a lot of, if you ain't girded up, taking your mind off what's important. And a lot of our people getting caught up in the sensationalism of just leaving and being pure in some Africa or wherever you're going, and not focusing on being pure and having that virgin mindset in the scriptures until we are placed in our land. It's starting to, I'm starting to see that it's starting to become a stumbling block more than an asset for Israelites.
And what's interesting is everything that they're doing now, some want to move to Ghana, Tanzania, it's already been done 40, 50 years ago by others of Israel at that time. Back in the 60s, they said, well, everybody's going to go to Liberia. That's the place set aside in Africa. If you know the history of Liberia, you know that was set aside by the U.S. government. Actually, Liberia was for a while an American colony in Africa that was set aside for freed slaves to move there. So a lot of them assume, okay, well, that's where we go. And you can see the leadership went astray, and the people were led astray. And false prophets emerged with their scenario of how to get back. In fact, we were challenged a few months ago to incorporate our study and fellowship group with a false prophet that's based in Israel. One of our people in this group that's no longer with us was encouraging and imploring to me to allow this brother to come in the midst of our study groups and be a part of us. But I already knew who he was and what he was about, and I knew he was not the right fit for what we're trying to do, because he has a record of having led people astray. This brother said that he was going to part the Hudson River to lead people out of America to go back to the land. Isn't that right, Emma Patel? You remember hearing about that guy saying that?
Kane, that is true. I can't think of his name. He was a so-called prophet.
Yeah.
Young Jadakoti's dad. I can't think of his name, but anyway, he did say he was going to part the Hudson River.
And the Hudson River, did it part?
No,
I
not
don't
at all.
think it did. Yeah.
So,
Okay. So I remember in 2001 here in Chicago, there was a guy that used to be Farrakhan's cameraman. Wherever Farrakhan would go, this young man would be with Farrakhan wherever Farrakhan went, filming his speeches and everything. I mean, he just grew up under Farrakhan here. So this brother came into some truth and decided to step out into Israelite ministry and leave the Nation of Islam. And he imagined in 2001 that he, because that was the turn of the millennium year, that was the reason he should lead Israel to the promised land at Passover 2001. Now, at the time, he was reaching out to people to follow him. I just told him, man, I couldn't go with that. And then he would get adamant and then come out talking hard against you. And finally, I just said, you a false prophet. You are not to be feared. So this guy, who wasn't even, I guess, internet savvy at that time. That was the phrase they would use, that people not functioning well because the internet was still kind of new. So he just sent out letters to everybody against me. Letters, see, nowadays people put stuff up on YouTube. Well, YouTube wasn't up by then. And so I said, I could get angry. I know where this brother lives. And I could just, tell him a thing or two. And I said, no, tell him what that would lead up to. So I just said, let's just wait and see that he hangs himself. And so he said, everybody, all Israel got to meet at the University of Chicago, Illinois, in downtown Chicago, at such and such a time on Passover night, 2001. Because he had been instructed by Yah to lead all the Israelites back to the promised land. All right. Passover 2001, that was 21 years ago. So I asked somebody what happened that night. I said, well, the brother was there on the corner at the college, and it was just him and his family. Nobody else showed. So after that, we never heard no more about him or from him. Okay, so I mean, these are instances of leadership gone astray. I want us to tonight delicately go through this closing part 3 of our 3-part series, which was called Judgements from the State of Israel and the Timing of the Return of the Israelites from America to the Land, part 3. And tonight we will study part 3 of our research in Isaiah chapter 18. And look also at the scriptures in Isaiah 17 in relation to our topic tonight regarding the fall and judgment of the government of the state of Israel. The government of the state of Israel is, to me, the biggest roadblock for why we're not in the land right now. It's the government of Israel. Um, all right. And so it's important to understand what Yah is going to do with that roadblock. And there's some scriptures here that we have been reviewing in the last few weeks about how that roadblock of the state of Israel is going to be removed, because this really sets up the timing for the return to the land by the children of Israel coming out of the American captivity. So, Minister, could you read for us, Mr. Yeshran, can you read for us verses 1-4 of Isaiah 18?
Isaiah 18, verses 1-4. Woe to the land shadowing with wings, which is beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, that sendeth the ambassadors by the sea, even in the vessels of bulrushes upon the waters, saying, Go, ye swift messengers, to a nation scattered and peeled, to a people trembled from the beginning thereunto, a nation met it out and trodden down, whose land the rivers have spoiled. All ye inhabitants of the world and dwellers on the earth, see ye, when he lifted up an ensign on the mountains, and when he bloweth a trumpet, hear ye. For so Yahweh said unto me, I will take my rest, and I will consider in my dwelling place like a clear heat upon herbs, and like a cloud of dew in the heat of harvest.
Right. Thank you, Minister. I love that part in verse 2 where it talks about a scattered and peeled people. And that's clearly talking about you and me here in this captivity of America. As some of you know in our history, Frederick Douglass would quote that verse. Every 4th of July, I always read Frederick Douglass's 4th of July speech at Rochester, New York in 1850. And if you haven't read it, I recommend you read it. Some of you probably have already read it. But in that speech, he draws some of the words out of verse 2 here of chapter 18. When he talks about how can America talk about an Independence Day when it's holding so many of us in slavery. That's a pretty hard-hitting message he was saying. And then he said, now, if what you're doing doesn't seem to be so big in terms of world history, he said, let me tell you. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but he said, and basically he was inferring that America really didn't know who it was dealing with when they were dealing with us. And he had understanding of who we were. People don't know Frederick was conscious. And a lot of people say, well, wow. But more than we realize, many of our people back in that time were maybe more conscious that they were Israel than we know now, because they were closer to the time when we first got here. So the knowledge and the information of the history of our history as Israel was still orally being known and talked about, even though they weren't writing it, reading it, they could talk it. And Frederick knew it and understood it. And he said, we are those people that are mentioned in Isaiah 18:2. That's what he was inferring. I'm paraphrasing, but that's what he was inferring. Yeah, we are those people. And he inferred in that speech that America is Babylon. And he said all of that's in that speech from 1850. That's why these scriptures must be sorted through to gain the wisdom and insight that Yah would have us to know before we do anything about planning how to get to the land. In fact, it's evident in verse 2. The Septuagint version, instead of saying ambassadors, it says messengers are to be sent to the scattered, peeled people. killed means these people have been plundered and stripped of things that are very valuable to them. And that certainly describes us, stripped and plundered. So we're going to move on. In verse 1, because this country doesn't know who it's dealing with when they dealt with us. Frederick was trying to tell them, like, y'all dealing with the wrong people to be mistreated. And some people told me, I remember my great-grandfather told my grandfather, my great-grandfather was born in slavery, and he died 12 years before I was born. But my great-grandfather said that it was Harriet Tubman that filled Frederick in on a lot of information of awareness about who we are. And that Harriet was conscious about us being Israel. My goodness, you can look at her life, the pattern of her life, the leadership she had. My goodness. Just incredible. How was all Yah-led leadership in her life. And she just did what Yah gave her to do. And she had a big influence on Frederick. And the basic summation was our people always understood that this is a country that really doesn't understand what they're dealing with us, because if they did, they would learn how to deal with us better. So when we come to chapter 18 of Isaiah, it's the time when Yah says in verse 1, woe. And you know, the woe means a pronouncement of dread and coming judgment on the country that has mistreated us and afflicted us and plundered us. So that's adding up. Okay, that a course of time develops where time's up for withdrawing us from here and judging the nation that has afflicted us. And that's basically what chapter 18 is about. However, what's fully clear, Frederick said this, and he quoted a scripture from Psalm 137. He said, now Frederick not only could say in the speech on the 4th of July who we were, but he could also say where we were headed or where we should be looking to go. He said, immediately as he said, we are the afflicted people, or the scattered people, mentioned there in verse 2 of Isaiah 18. But then he also went into this Psalm 137. He said, by the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept for Zion. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand its cunning loose, and may my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. Now, as you can see, Frederick understood who we were, but he also understood where we were to go. And he said, Jerusalem. He made that clear in that speech too. Now, yesterday, what was yesterday the commemoration of? It was a national holiday yesterday, right?
Well, I was just about to bring that up, but go ahead, Elder. You about to say it?
No, go ahead. You bring it up. I'm trying to provoke out here.
Oh yeah, I already had it on my spirit. I was gonna be like, and I didn't even notice until when I looked into it. The Martin Luther King "I Had a Dream" speech, and how you was going into a lot of our people was conscious of who we were, and how he was saying he was the visions of the promised land. He was talking about Jerusalem, but I never had known that all these years until just a recent when you was when I went into it. And that was what he was talking about. But when we always quote Martin Luther King, you know, he was giving us the direction of where we're going to be as a people. So he foreseen You know, he was ahead of his time. He foreseen where we gonna end up
Right.
eventually, and I think y'all showed him that, and that's where his hope and his faith came from.
Yes, yes. I had a good time talking with Imam Patel's uncle. How's your uncle doing, by the way, Imam Patel?
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah, how's he doing, your uncle?
I spoke with him last evening, and he said some really interesting things that let me know he is aware of something going on. It's being wrong. We didn't get into our normally when him and I talk, I always go back to the creator, Abba Yah. We didn't go there, but he kind of circled around it because he has to humble down. But his point was the difference in the times that we're living in. And I found that was a big step for him to say. Now, the operation that they did on him kind of is taking away his ability to speak fluently, but he's a little bit stronger. And I do appreciate you asking. I just check in with him, and he has a wealth of history. You know,
Well,
he's my last uncle, and I'm trying to stick by him.
Hallelujah. He impressed me because he was actually there at the speech that Mr. Ephraim was talking about. He was actually personally there.
All right.
When King gave his speech.
He did that was in D.C., wasn't it?
Yeah, he was there. It was in D.C. Now, that was the dream speech that Dr. King gave. And I remember as a boy watching that speech on TV live when King was giving that speech. But I remember, now that was 1963. But I remember 4 years later in 1967, seemed like everything always goes back around 67. Dr. King was no longer as popular among our people at that time. He was looked upon as an old fuddy-duddy, even though he was still a young man. He was only 38 years old. A lot of people don't realize that was a young brother. But he talked like he was somebody's great-grandfather with such profound wisdom. He was only 38 years old. But anyway, by 1968, that last speech that he gave at the church down in, no, it was actually the Masonic Lodge. That was in the Masonic Lodge in Memphis, Tennessee. He said something that has mesmerized Israelites, even though we don't have same point of view with him on a lot of things, but there was something that came through him. And I think that last night of his last speech, before he was shot and killed the next day, the Mountaintop Vision, where he said he had been to the mountaintop and he had seen the promised land. And he said, I may not get there with you, but we as a people shall get to the promised land. For mine eyes have seen the glory of the Most High. Now, they played that speech a lot yesterday. You know, it was King Day, national recognized day. And I hear that speech. It resonates in my mind. I thought about it, and I had written up this lesson tonight. But I was thinking about, okay, what kind of leadership influence did he have upon the Israelite movement in America right now? Because increasingly what I'm seeing, the world is noticing something about us here in America. I'm talking about the children of Israel. They're noticing that around the world, that there's a segment of people who they had known of as African Americans. There's a segment of people they had known of as Black Americans. And of course, the byword, the N-word. Now, it's becoming more evident, maybe because of the internet and YouTube. Increasingly, the world is seeing a phenomena that this group, which is actually the second largest population group in America, in the millions, about like 40 million people of us, that increasingly more of them are identifying themselves, as they say around the world, as Jews. But they also notice these are a different kind of Jew that's not in league with the Jews that run the state of Israel. And it's interesting that the more the powers that be have tried to put us away from this kind of knowledge and identity, it is as though the more they push at us, the more we keep popping up, bigger and stronger than ever before. And that's where we are now. We're at a major turning point. And these scriptures, like Isaiah 18, these are scriptures that are for us to know. Of all the chapters I've seen in the scriptures, I've not seen Gentile commentators really come to a conclusion, a definitive conclusion about what this chapter means. And it's apparent that it's a chapter that's only to be understood by us at this point. It's a message to us. And we've, for the last 2 weeks, have spent time covering the details of it. But here's the part that we're going to look at briefly. Part 3, or part 2 last week, we looked at how this chapter intersects with chapter 17 of Isaiah. We had me and Minister Yeshurun about a year ago a study called the War Scrolls, where we covered this. Minister Abdel, I believe you remember having sat in on some of those sessions we had back then. What we have come to understand is there are a series of events over there that signal the series of events for us over here in preparation for us to go there. And this is why this section of scripture is very important, though it's very much a misunderstood section of scripture. One thing is if the state of Israel is the main roadblock to going there. Now, if I can tell you now, think about it. If the state of Israel was not in control of the land, or at least if they were in control of the land, but would allow us to move over there, do you think as many of our people would be wanting to go to Ghana, Kenya, South Africa? Would a lot of Israelites be moving to those places right now? I don't think so. If they knew they could go and live in their own land, that's where most of us would be. I'd be there right now, to be honest. So what's happened is okay, if these people are in control of the land, that are there to hinder us from our Yah-given right to the land, then they're there for a reason. They're there for a purpose. Nothing slips by Yah's plans and purpose on anything. As hard as that may be for us to understand, if they are there to hinder, then it's clear that Yah's not telling us to stop going there, but it's clear he's saying it's not the time for you to be there. So tonight, really, we're going to pick up in part 4. We already dealt with part 3 tonight. Part 3, we're talking about the timing. Minister, could you read us verse 7 of chapter 18?
Isaiah chapter 18, verse 7.
Uh-huh.
In that time shall the present be brought into Yah of hosts, a people scattered and peeled, and from a people terrible from their beginning hereunto. A nation meted out and trodden underfoot, whose land the rivers have spoiled, and to the place of the name of Yah of hosts, Mount Zion.
Now notice he said there in that verse, in the KJV, it tells you the time when you're to go back to the land. It's actually there. You see that? It tells you, it says, in that what time? All right. So, I mean, this is a scripture, this is a verse that tells you exactly, explicitly the timing. All right. Now, what we must understand too is that the timing of this return has to be precipitated by certain events that take place before your time to go back in. One is what we saw in chapter 17 of Isaiah. Before you go back, the main impediment in your way has got to be removed. I mean, the government of the state of Israel is the main impediment. They're the ones, when they saw us coming over there in 1970 from Liberia, they got their government, parliament, to change the law on how you can come into the land. See, up until 1969, if you wanted to go to the land of Israel, all you had to do was tell them when you got there that you are a Jew or Israelite, and that you want to live according to the Torah, that your ancestors came from there. Hey, as long as you were a person of, a legitimate standing with, legitimate documentation of who you were, it was a given. You could live there, you could move in. And then they started seeing the plan unfold that started here in Chicago, that some of us were going to go over there and live. And we don't look like them. And then they saw that, and so their government got with their rabbis and made this law, saying, well, you got to convert to Judaism, the religion of the rabbis. Then you can come in. Well, now, you see, so with that said, now these people, since they passed that law 50 years ago, all right, it's been a half a century. Our people here, we have a large segment of our people want to go and live in the land. They're ready to leave America. But Israel says, the state of Israel says no. Now, in verse 7 of chapter 18, Yah says, in that time, we have to look at what time. Well, verse 5 and 6 tell us it's a time that's described in chapter 17, verse 3, where it says in verse 3, the fortress will cease from Ephraim, which is what the state of Israel is called by the prophet Isaiah, because it's a consortium of Ashkenazi who have blended together around a segment of Israel that was scattered northward, who were of the tribe of Ephraim. Minister, could you read for us Psalm 120? Psalm 120. All right. Psalm 120. And if you could read for us, let's see. Verse 5.
Psalms chapter 120, verse 5. Woe is me, that I sojourn in Meshech, that I dwell in the tents of Kedar.
All right. So Meshech is the region that we would call Central Asia or Eastern Europe, in the region and vicinity of Russia. Now, this is an Israelite who's saying, I'm way up here living among these people in the Caucasus mountain areas. And he talks like in verse 6, my soul have long dwelt with him that hateth peace. I am for peace, but when I speak, they are for war. So there were Israelites scattered up there, but they were a minority. And in course of due time, some people in those areas intermarried with the Hebrews that were there, and some of them began to adapt some of the religion of the Israelites at that time. So now, with that said, most of who we call the Ashkenazi, they come from that area. That's around Meshech. All right. Then we see that some of Israel was scattered to the south to dwell in the tents of Kedar. And see, ancient Kedar was where Yehuda, many of Judah, the southern king, they scattered down there, and that's down in the southern Arabian Peninsula near the Horn of Africa. That's going through areas, like Yemen and all of that. Those people were Black. And then they moved over into Africa. Some of them moved all the way to West Africa, like the Yoruba. See, the Yoruba got records or oral history and genetics. So they did not originate in West Africa. That's clear. So we have records that some of our people scattered south and some of our people scattered north. The people that scattered north, they were scattered by the Assyrians. Mitch, could you read for us 2 Kings chapter 16 and verse 6?
2 Kings chapter 16, verse 6. At the time, Rezin, king of Syria, hold on, I lost y'all. 2 Kings chapter 16, verse 6. At the time,
17, verse 6.
Oh, sorry. 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 6. In the 9th year of Hosea, the king of Assyria, took Samaria and carried Israel away captive in Assyria, and placed them in Halah and Habor by the river of Gozan, in the cities of the Medes.
Now, all those areas, those spots are places leading up into the Caucasus Mountains, beyond the Euphrates and Tigris River regions as you go through Turkey, Armenia, and moving up into Georgia, not the state, but the country, and moving on up into Ukraine. That's where the northern tribes were scattered. They were called Samaria because that was their capital. The southern tribes, Judah, they scattered southward through Kedar and on into the region of Cush in Africa. This is what the sociologists call the Bantu migration, but the term Bantu is not really a real word. That was made up by a racist white man from Germany in 1850. Before that, nobody ever used the term Bantu. So we have to be aware of some distortions of history that are not clearly evident about the movement of Israel. That's one thing. And the Jewish people, because they've had influence through being white, have been able to present their position and point of view that they're Israel, but they have done all they can to suffocate and cloak the identity of Israelites that are Black, particularly of this nationality of Israelites out of America. With that said, when you look in chapter 17 of Isaiah, it says in verse 3, the fortress shall cease from Ephraim. It was Ephraim, as the minister read, one of the 10 tribes whose capital was Samaria. They went up north. The Assyrians put them there. As they come back and they're in the land, the prophet Ezekiel in chapter 16, verse 53, he says, and he's talking to Judah and Jerusalem. Minister, if you can be so kind for us to read that in chapter 16 of Jeremiah, verse 53 through 55.
We want Jeremiah chapter.
Not chapter? Jeremiah, Ezekiel, chapter 16, verse 53 through 55.
Ezekiel chapter 16, verses 53 through 55. And when I shall bring again the captivity of Sodom and her daughters, and the captivity of Samaria and her daughters, then will I bring again the captivity of the captives in the midst of them, that thou mayest bear thy own shame, and mayest be confounded in all that thou hast done, and that thou art a comfort unto them. Then thy sister Sodom and her daughters shall return to their former estate. Samaria and her daughters shall return to their former estate. Then thou and thy daughters shall return to your former estate.
Now, chapter 16 of Ezekiel, verse 1, the prophet is told to speak to Jerusalem. He's saying, Son of Man calls Jerusalem, in verse 2, to know her abomination. So Jerusalem was the capital of Judah. So he's speaking to us there. He's speaking to Judah. But he's telling Judah in verse 53 of that chapter that Samaria, which was the capital of the northern tribes, the chief of those tribes was Ephraim, that Ephraim, he's going to be back in the land before you do. It's clear as day in that scripture. Now, so the fact that there is a state of Israel there, comprised of a people that emanate from the northern hemisphere regions, where Meshech, some think Meshech is another name for Moscow. I don't know. But I know that's the general population region of Eastern Europe. We also know, as we just reviewing again, that Ephraim, which was the largest tribe of the northern tribes, whose capital was Samaria, he was known and renowned to have mixed himself with other nationalities of people. That's the one in chapter 7, verse 8 of Hosea. And Mr. I sure am appreciative of your help with us on this. If you would be so kind to read for us chapter 7, verse 8 of Hosea
chapter 7, verse 8. Ephraim have mixed himself among the people. Ephraim is a cake not turned.
Cake that's not turned, or like a pancake, it means the side of it that looks like dough, it can't be brown. And what we have now are people who don't look like brownies. We see people that look like dough running the land of Israel now. In fact, when I went to the land of Israel the first time, I never forget, I would go through there and I'd hear little white Jewish kids, out on the streets, saying, point their finger and say, look, cushy, cushy. I said, why they calling me a cushy? And then I went to the little local store. I saw all these little brownie cakes. And I said, I want some of them brownies. They said, oh, you want a cushy? Even the brownies were called cushies. All right, so now I'm a cushy. What does that make them to be? I just say they're doughboys. That's just what I came to say. You're a doughboy. All right, so the cushy Judah, the doughboy, became Ephraim because he mixed himself. So anytime you go to Israel, you hear somebody calling you a cushy, just say, well, it's better than being a doughboy. It's like a cake not turned. So anyway, so they have commandeered their whole identity to be the ones who make the determination whether you can be in the land or not, because they're there first. But the fact of the matter is, if you read just a little bit further, Minister, could you go back to chapter 16 of Hosea, 16 of Ezekiel, that is.
Salika, Elder, I have a quick question.
Yes.
So that Ephraim that's there now, they're practicing Judaism. So they're going to definitely be under that judgment when the Most High destroy that land.
Oh, yeah. And that's why Isaiah 17:3 says that the fortress of Ephraim will fall. You see, they're there first. And then Yah said in Ezekiel 16, verse 53, that when he brings us back, there will be some of them still there. And these will be more or less as the survivors.
Okay.
You know, the remnant of survivors of them that were not wiped out by that war, because most of them are going to be wiped out by this war that's coming. Okay. All right. And that war has got to happen. The war has already started there with them in Syria that we read in chapter 17. Now, Minister, you got chapter 16 there. Could you read for us in chapter 16? And if you could read verse if you could read verse 60 and verse 61.
Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 60 and 61. Nevertheless, I will remember thy covenant with thee in the days of thy youth, when I will establish unto thee an everlasting covenant. Then thou shalt remember thy ways and be ashamed. And when thou shalt receive thy sisters, thy elder and thy younger, I will give them unto thee for daughters, but not by thy covenant.
All right. Now, the ones that are there now in the land, there's two captivities that have come back. One captivity was the captivity of Sodom. It came back into power in the land. Now, Sodom is the ancient name for survivors of the ancient city of Sodom. There were only 3 survivors of the ancient city of Sodom. It was Lot and his 2 daughters. Now, you know that Lot's wife, she came out, but she didn't survive because she turned back and looked at the burning of Sodom, and she became a pillar of salt. But the 2 daughters, when they saw that the devastation was so bad, and they and their father were living in an isolated location in the mountains, they assumed that all mankind had been destroyed. And so in their mind, you know, now they grew up in Sodom where all kind of abominable stuff was going on. So in their mind, they assumed they had to keep mankind alive, since there was only one man they felt in the world, which was their father. They went ahead and conceived by their father while he was drunk. He didn't know. And they had two sons by their father. One's name was Ammon, the other one's name was Moab. And so today, the captivity of Sodom is represented by those people who in ancient times were called Moab and Ammon, the Moabites and the Ammonites. Now, the Moabites and the Ammonites comprise the nation today that we call Jordan. In fact, the capital of Jordan is called Ammon. So they have a nation of them. Their captivity has come back. And you know, part of Jordan actually is part of the nation of Israel. There's a segment of Israel that's east of the Jordan River, that's in the nation of Jordan. And some Hebrews, since they can't move into Israel, some Hebrews are moving into Jordan because they say, well, part of that land is part of Israel too. I can't argue with that, but I wouldn't want to live under that government in Jordan either. But they're there, and in 1946, they became a nation, the nation of Jordan. So Sodom and its captivity came back in 1946. Then you had in 1948, the state of Israel came back. And well, it's described here in verse 53 of chapter 16 of Ezekiel as Samaria, because that was the capital city of the northern tribes. So we have with Ephraim, because he's intermixed with these other nationalities of people and companions, there's a few of them that actually do among the Ashkenazi have the same Hebrew bloodlines, but then the rest of the people are primarily converts, and converts from the Khazar, converts from the Edomites, converts from the Polish, Russians, all kind of Eastern. So they're really more of that than they are of any ancient bloodlines of Israel, but some of them actually do, and they don't look like you and me. Some of them actually do have E1B1A. Some of them, a small group of them, or some of them have E1B1B. There's close to about 20% of them that do have ancient Israelite haplogroup, but they don't look black, they look white. But again, skin color doesn't change your DNA. That's the thing about DNA. Skin color doesn't change your DNA. Hey, shalom, Dr. Davis. Good to hear from you. How you doing? We're studying the timing for our return to the land. So they were supposed to come back before us, and in 1948, that collective of people that have merged themselves around what remains of Ephraim, they came in and formed the state of Israel, 1948. Now, here's where we see chapter 17 of Isaiah comes in. Again, I'm going to read from the Septuagint of that. No, I'm actually going to read from the ancient Aramaic Targum of verse 53. The ancient Aramaic Targum, which is a translation from Hebrew into Aramaic that was written about close to 100, 200 years before Yeshua. Its translation says in verse 3, instead of the fortress of Ephraim shall fall, it says that the government of Ephraim will fall. So if the prophet Isaiah in 17:3 is talking about a time in the end time where there's a government of Ephraim, that it will fall at the time that's described in verse 1 of chapter Isaiah, when Damascus is destroyed, which has not happened historically, it's future. So then that must mean there must be a future government comprised of what remains of Ephraim today, and that would be the state of Israel. It's when that falls, when that government falls, that's when the time for you to come back.